Hello and welcome to the Doublethink Dialogues podcast. So today we're talking about population control. So pretty much my entire life, so from the 70s, and you assured me that probably from the 60s, there's been talk of, concern with overpopulation of the human species on the planet. And so a lot of talk about should we implement population control? Should we reduce the population? Should we have less children? I mean, China went as far as the one-child policy, which hasn't really worked out very well for them, or isn't working. They're paying the price, let's say. So I guess, so I would currently, and I wouldn't at the time, I agreed with a lot of this as well as I was growing up, because it seemed like the population was at a runaway pace. And we're all like, oh, we're going to have 20 billion people or something. I think there was what was the story? Make Room, Make Room. Is it Harry Harrison? I think maybe, which led to the Soylent Green movie. 20 million people in New York and had to be, scooped up and everything. And they began eating people because there were too many people. But the question, so for me, the point has become, and I think I've become aware that the idea that I see it as we're not going to overpopulate the earth. And in fact, we're going to decrease population soon. There has been some talk of this, but that's still not the prevalent theory. And so you have particularly some strong ideas, I think, on population control, at least, and regulating populations. So what are your thoughts? Just, I guess, to start with, are we going to have runaway population control? And then maybe dependently or independently, should we be controlling the population?
I think I fall short of population control in the sense of you can only have 1, 2, 3, however many children. I probably still favor influencing population, doing things when we have a choice, doing things that will tend to lead to less population growth or indeed population decline. I mean, my background goes back to that era. Maybe the concerns were probably there both up and down, going back to Malthus even. I don't know, but it certainly was hitting some people's minds at a time when David Attenborough showing pictures of nice animals and of huge wrecking balls clearing areas of forest and such like it. For me, the driver was very much space for wildlife, for it wasn't a question of, can we survive as humans? It's just that more humans means less space for natural vegetation and wildlife, and that seemed to be very much under threat. And I don't know of anyone saying that threat has gone away. I mean, every year that the space left for that is smaller. So, and I suppose, I know you think not look forward, but you fear a time when the population is crashing, basically.
Yes.
And I suppose in parts of Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, you are already moving into that space, and Japan. And Korea.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that we're all moving into that space, from birth rates. If you ignore immigration, which is something we've talked about in previous episodes, then the birth rates are sub-replacement in almost every country in the world.
It seems, for me, trying to find the figures, that's almost taboo information, because separating out the immigrant birth rate from the indigenous birth rate is something when really it's not supposed to be doing.
Yeah, it's difficult. But I think one thing that also happens is, and again, a reason why I'm pretty certain we will have this decline is because as you bring people up in economic level and let's say into a more technological society, and I see this as natural consequence, is they will have less children. Now, some people will argue, they have less children because it's expensive, which it is. That's largely because there's lots of things you want your child to do, bring them to all sports games and everything. But it's also just because infant mortality is lower. So in the developed societies, you have a lot lower infant mortality, in which case you don't need to have as many children for them to survive. And so it's natural that when you raise the level of standard of a society, you're going to have less children. And so for me, again, maybe we'll skip it. I don't want to skip ahead too far, but for me, that this is something that's happening, and it's going to continue to happen as we raise other parts of the world up into higher economics strata as well. And that's not saying we shouldn't raise them, because I do think we should, or they should raise themselves, or should be allowed to raise themselves, either way. But it's a consequence we're going to have to think of. I don't want to be a doomsayer, because I have been accused of that in this regards. But I feel like, and I'm not saying it will happen, I'm saying it if left to its own devices naturally and we don't pay attention to it, then I think it will happen. I think there are ways to stop it from happening. Some of them are reasonable and some of them are not reasonable. And some of them lead to dark places, but there are possibilities. But there have been a lot of attempts at various forms of population control over the years. I think we were kind of going over a few before we started recording. A lot of them stem from the 1930s. So we have the obvious famous one would be Hitler, in regards to some of the populations he didn't like, including the Jews in Germany, and outright extermination. Now, that's a very extreme form of population control. But another one we were talking about was Planned Parenthood, which is definitely a form of population control. We can perhaps delve into that. And I just wondering your thoughts on sort of some of these.
Okay, yeah. Looking at, just as you mentioned there, Hitler, I think you have to maybe mention that he wasn't concerned about level of population. I mean, he
that is true. Yes,
replace Jews and Slavs with good Germans, and I should say for anybody typing this that there was meant to be irony in the word "good" there. That wasn't my personal endorsement of Hitler's views. So, and I think that there has been maybe concern, again, going back to Malthus, about rising population, also concern about wanting population to rise. I mean, I think India has had, maybe still has, a large, well, maybe many more than one of them, a large digital counter of population, which must be largely kind of interpolated. I'm sure they can't actually count each birth as it happens, but that is regarded, that is not where it stands above some square somewhere. That is not there as a, isn't this awful? Watch this and go home and practice contraception. It is fantastic. We're going to pass China soon. I don't know if
they have passed China.
Right, I'm a little behind them. It's definitely a boast rather than a warning, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there's still there's pressures both ways. You're mentioning, and I'm sure there is a lot of correlated data for birth rates dropping with affluence, but we don't actually know for sure if that applies across every culture. I mean, it applies across the cultures it's happened in so far. I wonder if, can we be sure that Africa isn't an exception? I mean, I recall an interview and this is going back to, I think, to the Rhodesian in Zimbabwe run up to independence, run up to black majority rule independence, that is, not white majority rule independence, interviewing black people, black men, on what they hoped for from a new society which they would run. And pretty much the universal answer was 6 children.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, well, none of you have said, this is because of the high infant mortality rate, or the economic growth we want to Zimbabwe to have. It's I'm a man and I want 6 children, and until such drops happen, I would not have the confidence that they're going to happen. That my other point would be that yes, we may have a long-term trend of heading into declining population, but we have to get, the trend is still upwards, and we have to get through a half century, a century in which major climate change is forecast, so major uncertainty about food production. So, I mean, I would not project forward my ideas on encouraging slower population growth, I would say, rather than controlling or even population growth reversal. I'm not projecting them beyond the next 100 years. It may be that, but my point is that we, and hopefully from my point of view, the natural world have to get through that period before we then can start worrying about, or we'll find ourselves having to worry possibly about terminally declining human population.
Yeah, well, it's definitely going to be a century of turmoil. I mean, there's I don't think anyone's doubting that right now. You've got a lot of things you've touched on there. Food is an interesting one because it's topical at the moment with the various farmer protests, and food is. There are some who say, let's put it that way, that the production of food is under attack by the powers in the world for whatever reason. And this maybe leads into the whole cricket thing, eating crickets, but it does seem to be, for whatever reason, some attack on farming. We've had Canadian fertilizer issues. We've had Netherlands farmers. We've had German and French farmers. Now we've had more than 100 food manufacturing plants in the U.S. I think in 1 year went up in flames. So that's an interesting thing with food. Also, it should be mentioned that Ukraine was one of the top 4 food producers in the world, and is currently obviously in the middle of a war. So that's an interesting one. With regards to Africa, I was also just thinking. So I've talked with you a lot of times on my thoughts on how the population will increase and decrease. I talked about it largely also in relation to the mouse utopia experiment, which was a mouse experiment that showed something similar. But I have had some other thoughts on that recently, which leads me to a sort of Handmaid's Tale version of this. Margaret Atwood. I don't know if you've read that, but in the Handmaid's Tale, what's happened is the fertility of rich people, especially rich women, has basically dropped off. There's been a chemical contaminant, and so they have to find fertile women to continue breeding, and so they've created this sort of society to do that. And it occurs to me that there's a link here that I've been thinking about with the mouse utopia experiment, with the drop in human fertility, and with a noticeable drop in animal fertility as well, which all coincide to approximately the same time, which would be, let's say, around 1970, give or take. This is where all of these things started dropping off. And this is undoubtedly where we had the rise of the creation of plastics, for example, which ties into some of the environmental issues as well. And so the creation of certain endocrine disrupting chemicals, which we now know to be widespread in the environment, has had the results of not only altering gender behavior, and we notice this in animals because we've actually discovered male birds that have female plumage, and you're like, well, an animal can't just choose what to look like, right? It's got to be born that way. So that's an interesting one. And then we also have a decline in fertility, again, across the entire animal kingdom, including humans, but also, again, frogs was one that was noticed in as well. Where they're even changing sexes because of the chemicals. And so male and female fertility has dropped as well. And so it makes me wonder then, is there some hope by the powers that, let's say, maybe there's a less contaminated segment of Africa, and that's why they're hoping that all this mass immigration will help boost population rates or something. Maybe they're feeling like, oh, the West are too contaminated now. They can't have children as easily, so we have to bring in people who are less contaminated. That would be I don't know. I'm not staking any kind of claim on that view. That's just something that occurred to me as I was listening to your comments, and that could be a possibility. You never know what the powerful people are thinking. But
I can see them, these them having that perspective. I have a more primitive perspective, I suspect, but one that some people, might say, well, yes, that is primitive. In fact, it's racist. But I don't think it's useful to call it that if it is the perspective of most people of most races. Because basically, if you're going to condemn other races for racism, the whole thing just gets pretty silly. But a perspective, and it's an elite perspective, that what matters is keeping the European economy booming so the people at the top of it have a good standard of living. And if that means replacing Europeans with Africans, as the working class of this, do we care? They were, we regard them as a virtually different species anyway. So, it's like changing, yes, we'll change over to
Yeah, I must
freezing
state that I
cattle.
have to disavow all these comments. No. But I see, yeah, it is dangerous area to talk about, isn't it?
Yeah. But the level, and I've never been, a knocker of capitalism, a shouter of Marxist slogans on the street, but the capitalist level that sees people as totally interchangeable and doesn't mind if you replace the population of one country with new stock is not. It doesn't seem to me that is sufficiently in line with the people, particularly the people who are going to be replaced, or the people who just think, well, no, actually, it's not the economy, it's us. It's us living our lives, and something that either replaces us or doubles our output by doubling our numbers by other people coming in. It is not good news in our view. So I think there is a basic difference of perspective there, and the problem is that the archaic perspective is becoming unacceptable. If you care which people live where, that is not that is bordering on unacceptable now. And even though it is a view that would be shared by ordinary people around the world.
Well, we have a lot of things that used to be normal thought, let's say 150 years ago, again, worldwide, not just in the West, that are now considered heavily taboo, if not illegal. I mean, you could think of child marriage, let's say, to 12 to 16-year-olds. We say, oh, okay, the Islamic cultures allow for that generally, and we consider it to be child abuse. But if you go back in England 150 years ago, or maybe even less, that was still a fairly normal thing as well, wasn't it? So, so it's kind of like our enlightened view of certain things, whether you want to agree with that or not, is.
Certainly in these, even in the regards I'm talking about, you can fault the attitude of Europeans in the 19th century, but I would suggest a lot of their view was sort of froth, if I can say the word, on the surface of what they were saying. I mean, they, like lots of other people, would have had a view that their country was, what mattered was their nation being in their country, and people all over Europe were fighting for that in the 19th century. And I'm sure they. I'm not sure. I'm not that familiar with them, but it wouldn't surprise me if the Zulus regarded themselves as a cut above some other African groups. But building that into a philosophy or a science of superiority was unfounded, over the top, and superfluous. You could have carried on looking after your own interest without building that rhetoric of actually, this is God's will, or it's defined by evolution, or whatever. If you're European at a certain time, if you look at the technical progress made, you would have, as a naive person, you could quite naturally have thought, well, obviously we're better. But if you're less naive, you'd say, well, actually, we've had some lucky breaks and we've reached this technical point, but we're not, we're still fundamentally the same.
Yeah, I don't even know naivety. If you think about, let's say you think about people from that time, so Industrial Revolution, UK versus, pre-developmental Africa, in a way. It's only, I think, by a modern sort of wider view of history that we perceive the factors that have led us to be, let's say, the first country to industrialize in a kind of combination of positioning, geographical and climate related positioning, and luck in regards to say cultural and national development in the area. You can argue, like, and I think it's actually reasonable to argue that, and some people will consider this racist as well, I think it's pretty reasonable to argue that Africa would never have developed an industrial society by itself. And this is not any kind of comment on the Africans. This is a comment on the incredibly, ironically, harsh land that they live in, right? So Africa is a great continent for, um, let's say, the cradle of life, for giving birth to life, right? It's got huge amount of geography and a wide range of climates, most of them temperate. And so it's a great place for creating life. It's not a great place for creating civilizations because it does not have favorable geography for civilizations.
I've heard that
Yes.
suggestion of us being in a kind of Goldilocks place. Basically, they were places that were too harsh to develop in that way, and places that were too easy to do. Life was actually too easy to do. We were in between. It was, life was, was not easy, but it was not near impossible.
I think with the UK, it was that process, wasn't it? Where so you have, I mean, it's telling that one of the first, at least that we know of, advanced civilizations that arose, let's say Egypt, and across the Middle East, was immediately on the doorstep of Africa as you migrate out, right? It's like the first place you come to that's favorable, we develop a civilization. That doesn't mean that the people were the problem for that, like they lack something. That means that the geography and the climate and the area where they were living in wasn't favorable to these kind of developments. And so immediately we develop advanced civilizations after coming out of Africa. And then you get, Egypt with Rome, and then you get the development of Europe, and then sort of the battles and the conflicts and the crucible of forging advanced civilizations that Europe was. And then England, once we reach a certain level, we're basically like a castle with a moat around us. So we have a natural defensive position. Yeah. So it gives us a big advantage. Yeah.
And I mean, I don't doubt, again, though I don't know whether we would probably have here, but the Romans consider themselves a cut above the others.
I'm sure they did. I'm pretty certain they did.
Almost everybody has probably thought that.
And again, they were, right? They were for that time. Yeah. I mean, a society that had aqueducts and certain awareness of hygiene with regards to the washrooms and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been a tough argument to persuade a Roman to look at all that and say, well, no, you're just the same as these other barbarians, really.
Yeah, exactly, and that's kind of a weird thing. When going back to the interchangeability, and again, this is weird to me on the political spectrum because on the you'll talk about capitalism and you say, okay, well, they treat sort of people as, especially a working class, will be interchangeable, right? So you swap them out. And then you also have this with the progressive, let's say, diversity, inclusion, and equity programs. You have this idea of an interchangeability, right? So this is left versus right, having functionally the same views, but both are arguably harmful in different ways, right? So I just find that weird that you have these same views expressed in different ways on both sides.
And it leaves other people, where does it leave anyone else to go except making podcasts about the dilemma they find themselves in?
Yes, exactly. And I find it interesting. So we linking everything together with population control, I think, because one of the so with climate change, let's say global warming awareness and population control, you take it back further than I did, but it's almost as soon as we become aware that something is happening, that we're able to measure it now, right? Like, let's say global population, let's say global temperature. These issues, almost from the point where they're able to be measured effectively, we get scared, right? Yeah. We start seeing something we didn't expect, and we're afraid. Oh, it's going up. Yeah. Both of them were going up. Climate and population are going up, and we're like, oh, that's frightening. There's got to be a problem. We don't know anything about the systems. That's got to be a problem, right?
And that's what the same, you say up in those cases. I mean, there have been scares about the next ice age, haven't there?
Yeah.
And you're well up for a scare about population crash.
Definitely.
So, as soon as you see some change happening that you don't understand, it is natural to panic. Yeah. I suppose. I mean, the concrete spur to me of making it an issue that I believe strongly in, I think it has to be David Attenborough's. I don't know what the equipment was, but basically equipment for felling large areas of trees quickly. and then presenting that on television, and showing the nice animals that are thereby rendered homeless,
Yeah.
and seeing trends that say, actually this carries on till there's none of that space left, and it carries on further to when there isn't food for the different groups of people, or however they organize themselves to feed themselves. So it had a long-term extreme threat, and I thought actually there's a nearer threat, not so life-threatening to us, but certainly threatening to quality of life. Saying we're going to live in a planet where we're the only species, basically, which we ought to stop this process in time to prevent that, rather than waiting until either we have to stop it or we have a population crash through starvation. So it did seem an important issue to respond to in those days.
Yeah, I'm probably going to say something that'll make me maybe as unpopular as some of your comments. So made you probably.
I'm glad I'm a little naive about what I'm saying.
And this doesn't mean this is actually my opinion, because I'm still working my way through the pros and cons of this. But like you say, I mean, in some perspectives, and I agree with what you were just saying. Taken to a level, it kind of would go that way, right? We would end up being one of the few species on the planet, and we'd sort of be eating synthetic food, which is kind of where certain groups want to take us anyway. So maybe they'll recruit me after I say this, because part of me wonders. I almost look at, and I've discussed another aspect of this recently with like a solar system being an egg for a species. But I almost wonder if our planet, if I sometimes view it as an egg that we are being nurtured within as a species meant to go out into the galaxy. Like this is my view, right? I think there's no reason for an intelligent species to exist if it's not to spread intelligence elsewhere, or to spread life elsewhere even, right? And it's particularly intelligence. I don't know to what end, but who knows what the universe is. But and so to that end, now I don't want to be like just strip it all down and kill everything, right? That doesn't sound right either. But at some point, and I think this is the balance point, maybe a great filter, is the decision: do you protect all of the life on this planet? And keep in mind that life constantly changes. There are more species have gone extinct before us than with us, right? So do we focus on protecting all the life on this planet in a hyper-sustainable bubble, in which case we will likely be too afraid to do anything that would be required to get off the planet and into the galaxy, in which case I don't see a future for humanity in that particular scenario. And so the idea is like there's an ideal balance somewhere in there, but the balance can't be that we're afraid of harming nature entirely, right? I mean, we do have to live in nature, and we do have to protect it to a certain degree, and we have to be aware of what we're doing, and we can't let certain issues distract us from what some of the companies have done to affect that nature and our nature, as we've discussed. But at the same point, we can't be so afraid that we just trap ourselves here, in my opinion. Now, not everyone agrees with that. But then when I ask those people, well, what's your view of humanity? Where are we going to be in 1,000 years? Well, I don't know. It's just going to, whatever happens. I'm like, well, it's not going to happen if we don't want it to happen. Otherwise, we will just be another extinct species. And I think I still harbor some, I think, respect at least for humanity, that we are a species that should be saved and should continue on and out into the galaxy. But maybe it'll just be our robots. I don't know.
Well, I share your respect for humans and the rest of life on Earth, and would like to see them sustained. I suppose the English, the master of conservationist side, sort of hesitates. But yes, I'm on board for them going out into the universe in the hope that it's actually large enough so we can't mess the whole thing up in any very short time. I still think the next century is critical. The population rise is still a threat, an existential threat to us surviving at all, in terms of the possibility of nuclear war or some kind of other kind of very major meltdown, which again has to be avoided for us to have a future in the galaxy.
True.
And I don't. I mean, what we talked about earlier about different ethnic groups. But the point for me, the relevance of that was to me was that actually the point is not to keep the economy going. The point, so basically bringing in more people to make up for our low birth rate isn't a desirable answer.
Well, I think I agree with that on a number of levels, and we've talked about it through the immigration before as well. I mean, at the very least, it stops such people from and us, to be honest, from helping their cultures get past certain hurdles. Let's say I won't, because I don't want to say that those cultures are incapable. As I've already said, they're not incapable of advancing. They just have hurdles that are larger than the ones we faced. So in some ways they need help, right? As we've discussed previously as well in previous episodes, that colonization had its definite harms and downsides, but it did leave an infrastructure in place in Africa. So there definitely is issues with that. One thing I wanted to comment on, I think almost everyone agrees that this century is going to be a big one for the human race. We do have a very good indication of the maximum population, however, and a lot of people don't realize this. I didn't realize it until, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or a bit less. And that is because the birth rate globally has already stopped increasing. And so we know that. And so because of that, we know that we're going to reach a maximum birth rate, a maximum population, because the population is currently only increasing because of longevity and because of improved lifestyle, basically. That's the only reason our population is increasing right now globally, and almost entirely due to Africa and Asia. And so we know that unless everyone becomes immortal, and potentially even if they do, the population is going to reach a certain level. And then, well, the options are it either stays flat or it declines. And again, the decline, I mean, there are groups that wanted to decline. There are the powerful who have stated they want like 3 billion people at most on the planet. In Canada, there was actually something that was in really bad taste. There was a group set up in relation to the UN. So it was a UN group. I can't remember. It was called something like One Child, One Planet or something along that lines. Don't quote me on that exactly, because there's a bunch of groups with similar names. And they had a flyers out on bus stalls in Canada, in Vancouver. And it said something to the effect of, the best thing you can do for your child is to not have another child. Now that by itself is like, okay, that's a bit, but the problem that got them into trouble was they had a black baby on the poster. so you're like, that's, you're going against your base here.
Yeah.
Right.
That is a very interesting problem. That's the mismatch in that. I mean, I would distance myself a long way from the one child people, partly on the basis of, well, look, who are you? Who are you talking to? Yes, this is on the side of a bus in Montreal. What is the average birth rate for families who will be seeing this advertisement? And it's already substantially below replacement.
Oh yeah, it's below 2. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this bus is not going to be driving through Cairo
or South Africa or something.
Yeah. So, and in turn, and again, given my sort of out of date view that actually we still are there are subgroups within the human population that are significant. Now, I'm not presenting that as how it is and how it ought to always stay. I mean, I would anticipate an eventual merging of all the different diverse groups in the planet. My concern would, and a good and bad outcome would be, what is the relative gene frequency of my own group within the eventual mix? So basically, I'm anticipating my however many grandchildren being a complete mix with everyone else. I just want to see a fair share of me or us in that future mix.
Yeah.
So it's not a hostile attitude to the friendly competition, but not hostility.
Yeah. You seem almost the personification of the selfish gene. So with regards to the merging, something that's interesting to me is, so as we've said several times already in the show, this is going to be a one crazy century. And one of the things we're going to have to come to face with, and it was coined in the 90s, I believe, but it does look to be something that's going to very likely be real, at least in part, which is the technological singularity. And this is where a whole bunch of technologies come together in a way, sort of merging and feeding off each other in a way that we can't predict what the point past that will be, like what society will look like. I think in reality, the way that will play out, and if you think of the transhumanists who are all trying to put, like, and the World Economic Forum, like Klaus Schwab is always talking about putting chips in our heads so we can emote with people and stuff. And so you're going to get polarization, right, of society. And so you will, if in effect, let's say all the normies, let's call them, will possibly merge. And this is one of the science fiction points, right? So there won't, in like 500,000 years, there won't be necessarily white and black people. There would be, everyone would more or less have the same skin color, most
That
likely.
always seems to be used handcrafted in Star Trek, and you're in the future,
Yeah.
and you can still tell distinct red.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's very strange. Yeah, and then the other thing will be that those normies will be distinct from those who have adopted the full scale of the technology, basically, right? The transhumanist experience. And unfortunately, I don't remember the name of this book at the moment, but I did an interview on Alternate Futures podcast with Susan K. Quinn, I believe it was, who actually had a world building which is very similar to this, where you have these ascendant groups who have, like, the technology is they are technology, basically, right? And so they have these like godlike powers, whereas everyone else, all the normal people, their world has more or less been stripped, and they're just sort of all, let's say, impoverished, more or less, right? And that is a very real concern as well, because there are people who really, really want this kind of technological integration, and it won't be everyone that has it, and it will make huge differences. We already have, separation of society based on technological ability, let's say, and we're going to get, a full integration will mean even greater separation in this regard.
That is a feature of a lot of futurologies, and novels in general, is of a future underclass, and you're thinking, we're thinking in terms of the move towards equality, but the more remote futures that people are thinking of have a very kind of base level underclass, and as you say, a higher class that run things for them. And it's not clear to me that, well, maybe the author is not saying that's somewhere he wants to go. He's
no, definitely not.
Either that he thinks we are going to go, or is more dramatic as a storyline.
Yeah, I think she was exploring the human spirit in this case. Mm-hmm. So kind of the suggestion that these transhumanists had lost their soul. And so she did this through the idea of music primarily, and art. And so the transhumanists needed artistic people from, like, say, the normie class to create, because they lost the ability to create, because essentially they'd given their soul up for this transhumanist existence, basically. Yeah, and one of the things with equality, while we're talking about population and systems and stuff, is that we don't know, the way I look at it is, we don't know the upper reaches of human potential. So you can't, how can you pull everyone up to that same level without stopping people from going beyond a level? And so what that means effectively is, in the best case scenario, you'd be pushing down the top people to a baseline level. And at the worst case scenario, which is the one we always see so far in human history, is that everyone is pushed down to the lowest possible level, with the exception of a small number of elites.
One of the thoughts I have, linking in a sense to population control, in we've talked about before, which is what we now see as film donation, is really a counter to that. It's not something geared to changing numbers, because it basically it effectively replaces one child with a different child. It sort of interferes or offers motivations regarding a woman's choice as to who to have children by. Now, you could label that as elitist by saying, well, actually, what you're planning to do is to have the woman have her child by an elite man. And ironically, that is not elitism. I mean, elitism is we keep the elite quality special and rationed to us. We do not spread our elite qualities out to the hobbledehoy, basically. Elitism is not attempting to convert the masses to being elite. It is doing precisely the opposite. So this is basically a counter-elite movement that prevents this that works against this stratification of society, but which does actually give the higher status men an advantage in the fathering of children for women who have really got nobody to do that, who is going to contribute positively in a way that justifies that role. They haven't got someone who will support their children. They haven't got somebody who can be around the house without hitting somebody. It's somebody who's going to be a good father. They're without that. And we as society are going to step in and say, right, well, have your children by who you like. We will pick up the bills. But and I'm saying, well, yeah, we should be saying that, but we ought to be offering a little bit of motivation as to who she chooses as the father.
Yeah, that takes us into a lot of other issues but I think we're going to have to stop it for here, unfortunately, because we have gone on a little bit long. So maybe we'll definitely come back to that topic very soon. But that's about all we have time for today. So thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed, please like, share, leave a comment, and subscribe to Doublethink Dialogues. And we'll talk to you in the next episode.